Vibrant has one of the most overused words in the English language these days. We talk about vibrancy all the time among folks who lead congregations as ministers or lay people. For a while there, buzz was our favorite word, which makes sense when you consider that both buzz and vibrant are literally about vibration, the kind of energy that spreads even when it's barely perceptible. It's a sense of excitement characterized by a desire to bask in that energy. In urban planning, neighborhoods are called vibrant when they're destinations, places that have the kind of center that is dense. Vibrant neighborhoods have shops and restaurants that people want to patronize and do. Barbershops, salons, galleries, restaurants where people hang out together, interacting, seeing and being seen. Vibrant neighborhoods have stores that people need for their everyday lives without reliance on cars. These days, that kind of neighborhood is kind of a rarity. Such a rarity that there's been a system devised to score the vibrancy of a neighborhood. It's called a walk score, and the rating is determined by the amount of things that you can get done without ever having to get into a motor vehicle. Brooklyn, New York scores a 98. Peacedale scores a 68, which is pretty good. My neighborhood gets an 8. It's grim. You have to drive everywhere and nobody knows anyone anymore. The thing is that back in the early part of the 20th century, most neighborhoods and towns were naturally vibrant. It was easy for them to think of their town, their city, as the epicenter of the world. People lived in close proximity to one another on small lots with all the amenities nearby. They lived alongside the people they worked and played and prayed with, including the people who owned the shops and the services and the businesses. And every city in the United States was segregated, even in the North. Every neighborhood was a reflection of the social and economic status of the residents. You could see wealth in the storefronts, places like Park Avenue in New York City or Bellevue Avenue in Newport let you know who lived there and the resources they had. In just about every city, the black neighborhoods were modest, usually in the very modest to run down range. There just wasn't a lot of wealth there for folks who relied on employment outside of their neighborhoods. But those neighborhoods were functional. There was energy because people lived there and relied on the businesses because they had no other choice, not necessarily because they wanted to be part of it, so to speak. But Tulsa, Oklahoma was as segregated as every city in the nation. And yet in one way, it was exceptional. And that was its black neighborhood, Greenwood. Greenwood was teeming with businesses, restaurants, merchants, brokers, bankers, salons, galleries, all black owned and operated, and all the kinds of enterprises that still create vibrancy in neighborhoods. The majority of Greenwood's residents were solidly middle class. Some were even wealthy. They called the neighborhood the Black Wall Street. And it was vibrant. Photographs of the place show how alive it was and reveal the economic diversity of the people there. People who were proud to live there and participate in self-sufficient and mutually beneficial local economy. I'm sure it would have gotten a walk score of 98 if that kind of thing existed back then. Until May 30th, 1921. Memorial Day, the day of the parade in the reading that Lee just shared. Dick Rowland was, in the parlance of the day, a delivery boy. He was a legal adult, though a young one. He lived with his family in Greenwood and had a good job that took him all over the city. Sarah Page, meanwhile, was a white 17-year-old elevator operator in an office building in downtown Tulsa. Something happened in an elevator that afternoon where Sarah worked. I've read several different accounts. Some say the two were dating and met up there for a tryst in a building that they were sure would be empty. Others say it was an innocent contact that he accidentally brushed up against her, to the horror of another elevator rider. The story is inconsistent. What is consistent in the story is that the next morning he was arrested, and the newspapers immediately started calling him Diamond Dick, implying that he was too slick to be trustworthy. And she was portrayed as an innocent girl, an orphan working her way through business college. The newspaper coverage started that afternoon. The late edition of the Tulsa Tribune came out at 3 p.m. Above the fold of the front page headline, "Nab Negro for Attacked Elevator Girl." Even though the article wasn't nearly as incendiary as the headline would imply, it wasn't just a statement. It was a directive. And the message was, this smarmy boy attacked this innocent girl, and if you want to do her justice and protect all white women everywhere, it's your duty to nab a Negro. And everyone knew what that meant. Take out a black man. Any black man. There are some accounts that elsewhere in the paper that afternoon there was an editorial that made the directive more explicit, but nobody knows for sure. No copies of that newspaper exist. What we do know is that by 4 p.m., authorities were on the alert that a lynch mob was forming. And by sunset, hundreds of angry white men with guns and torches were gathered in front of the courthouse. Dr. Carlos K. Hill, chair of the Department of African and African American Studies at the University of Oklahoma, wrote in the preface of Tulsa, 1921, "The Tulsa Massacre is the deadliest outbreak of white terrorist violence against a black community in American history. Some black Tulsans fled for safety while others banded together to defend their lives and property. In the end, black resistance was futile. The white mob looted and then set ablaze practically every home and business in the Greenwood district. All told, in less than 24 hours, the 35 square blocks that constituted the Greenwood district, more than 12 churches, 5 hotels, 31 restaurants, 4 drugstores, 8 doctor's offices, 24 grocery stores, a public library, and more than 1,000 homes lay in ruin. The scale of destruction and loss of life unleashed upon Tulsa's black community was unprecedented in American history. However, it is important to note that the Tulsa Massacre was not an exceptional event. Over the course of American history, more than 250 episodes of collective white violence against black communities have occurred. Just 2 years prior to the Tulsa Massacre, similar large-scale outbreaks of white terrorist violence against black communities occurred in Dewey, Oklahoma, Elaine, Arkansas, Washington, D.C., and Chicago, Illinois. Walter Francis White was on the staff of the NAACP and later went on to be the organization's executive secretary. At the time of the Tulsa Massacre, he estimated that 150 to 200 black folks died and 50 white, though authorities reported only 36 deaths, 26 black and 10 white. But the locals knew better. For generations, people would pass a particular area just outside the city and whispered things like, "That's where they're buried." But it was rarely spoken about publicly. The whole thing was too scary, and a repeat of the event seemed too likely. History, we all know, is written by the victors, so it shouldn't surprise anyone to learn that the massacre was barely mentioned in textbooks, warranting little more than an occasional sentence. In 1996, a bipartisan group of Oklahoma legislators authorized the formation of the state's commission to study what was then called the Tulsa Race Riot of 1921, leading to new research and investigations. As a result, among other findings, new DNA evidence of the soil of the area rumored for nearly 100 years to be a mass grave are proving to be true. The new death toll is estimated to be more than 300. In 1999, journalist Randy Kriebel was assigned by the Tulsa World to cover the work of commission. He was to research and compile an archive for his use and for the use of the newspaper. What he found was that no records were kept, at least not systemically. The commission began a new conversation about the massacre. People were finally willing to talk, to share the stories of their own experiences, or more likely, because so much time had passed, the stories that were handed down through the generations. And these stories were handed down quietly. They had to be. Everyone was terrified that if they talked about it openly, even after all those years, if they exposed the ugly truth behind the disappearance of the most vibrant Black community in the nation, there would be repercussions. If they ever doubted their own fears, all they had to do was look at what happened in Dewey, Elaine, Washington, and Chicago for a reminder. Greenwood is a great example of how entire communities can suffer from a collective form of post-traumatic stress disorder. Their individual hurts and fears reinforce each other and even inform how their children and their children's children view not only the traumatic event, but also their entire worldview. There's a UU connection to the Greenwood Massacre. The Tribune, the newspaper that directed white residents to nab a Negro, was founded and owned by Richard Lloyd Jones. A silent partner in the endeavor was his father, Jenkins Lloyd Jones, the director of the Western Unitarian Conference. Architect Frank Lloyd Wright was Jenkins' nephew and Richard's cousin. Frank and Richard grew up together. There's speculation that the inflammatory editorial was written by Richard Lloyd Jones himself. And Richard was not only a member of All Souls Unitarian Church in Tulsa, he was also one of the founders of it, which makes sense considering it was the job of his father to plant new churches all through the westward expansion of the 19th century. It's a shocking and embarrassing bit of Unitarian history, isn't it? That one of our most prominent members may have incited what is probably the most devastating race riot in American history. In 1921, The World, the other newspaper in Tulsa, was the bitter enemy of the Tribune, and each paper wanted the other gone, and so The World jumped at the opportunity daily to blame the riot and massacre on the Tribune, solely on the Tribune. The narrative of blame continued even after the two papers merged in 1949 and didn't really end until the Tribune finally closed in 1992. According to Kriebel, the reporting was atrocious, inaccurate, and unapologetically biased on both sides. It was terrible reporting, fake news and disinformation in the service of wealthy holders of power. Kind of sounds like today. You know, in times like these, the kinds of times that create fear and trauma that can last decades, it actually serves us all better to not just tear down every opinion that challenges our existing worldview. We all owe it to each other to ask questions, right? Questions like, who is served by this reportage? Who benefits? Who loses? Whose voices are left out? What are the real social dynamics at play? And how will all of this be viewed by future generations? Are we, and more importantly, am I, behaving in a way that I can be proud of when I speak about this to those who come after me? And what responsibility do we, and I, have to right all the wrongs? Two people who were constantly asking themselves these questions were Reverend Marlin Levanhar and Bishop Carlton Pearson. Reverend Levanhar was the minister at All Souls Unitarian Church in Tulsa, the same church that was founded by Richard Lloyd Jones, the same church that is today by far the single largest congregation in our entire national association. Bishop Pearson, who is Black, was the very charismatic minister of an enormous, intentionally multiracial Pentecostal church in Tulsa, whose mission was to be a force of healing in a segregated community. But then he had a personal conversion to the doctrine of universal salvation and started talking about it from the pulpit. His reflections began as personal musings and evolved into theological statements of conscience. His message was so distasteful to his congregants that most of them just left. The seats were practically empty. Reverend Pearson couldn't pay the bills. After he lost his congregation and his livelihood, his Pentecostal peers declared him a heretic of the faith. He was destitute. And that's when Reverend Levanhar reached out to him. Now, All Souls was always a big church. After all, it's in one of those places that has lots of financial resources and a strong public expectation that everyone goes to church, with no exceptions. And it's one of only 2 theologically liberal churches in the entire region. So Reverend Levanhar invited Bishop Pearson to come to All Souls, to use the space for worship in his own community so that they would have a place to feel safe, to regroup, and maybe even grow again. But it turned into something pretty amazing. They aren't 2 separate churches anymore. They are one, served by no fewer than 4 ministers, worshiping in different styles with a diversity of theologies and practices that all make them stronger. Engagement is deeper, commitment is greater, more needs are being met, more lives saved, there's more vibrancy, more buzz. And they're constantly asking the tough questions about power and history and responsibility, telling the stories of the place that must not be forgotten. It's never easy, especially because early on, some people wanted to paint Reverend Levanhar and the mostly white UUs as saviors, which is just hurtful and wrong. Reverend Pearson died of cancer in 2023. There have been disagreements along the way, and they are still doing the work of racial healing in a way that very, very few communities are doing anywhere in the United States. The work of All Souls in Tulsa is a reminder that we didn't live the history. We may not have been there when people were killed or otherwise oppressed, but we have a responsibility to question how these events shape who we are now and the advantages that we benefit from so that we can change things for the better. I always try to imagine what it's like for people who lived in places like Greenwood or Detroit or South Providence, places that were destroyed by attacks from outside and uprisings within. Every day, residents live with the physical reminders of a brutal and oppressive history. Brutality and oppression that still continues. It may not be manifest in quiet tales concerned by DNA tests of soil, but it likely is evident in the blocks of vacant lots in formerly bustling shopping districts. That's the legacy of a history that I had no part in. But it's also a legacy that affects me deeply, a legacy I have a responsibility to heal. So I try to always be mindful of this complex history of oppression, especially during Black History Month. It makes me want to act better, to do more in community. So next Sunday, I'll be sharing a bit about the history of a local congregation here in South Kingstown, a neighbor of ours, uncovered while they did some research with school children. And I'll share a bit about what more we can do to help them. So I hope you'll join us.